collapse. So in April 2015, there was a historic agreement that was reached, and it collapsed in 2020 following the withdrawal of the US from the deal and the subsequent events. So let's start with Adnan Tabatabai. Adnan, what is Iran's position on where things currently stand? Because we are seeing with the Biden administration in particular, there is renewed optimism. So what's Iran's position on this, and what is your analysis of the situation?
Thank you very much, dear Neva, and thanks to the Middle East Dialogue Center for setting this timely discussion up. And I'm honored and privileged to be on a virtual panel with fantastic colleagues, Cinzia, Andreas, and Sami, and obviously yourself, Neva, helping us to navigate through this discussion. Well, I will start with some brief thoughts on where we stand. Obviously, the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, is something that the Iranian political elite would preferably try to keep alive. If they wanted to let the whole thing fall apart, they had enough opportunity to do so. You referred to the US withdrawal, which happened in May 2018. Iran decided to adopt what they called strategic patience and continue to abide by the obligations of the nuclear agreement in the hope that abiding by the agreement, in spite of the US having left it, would incentivize the European partners of the agreement, Russia and China, to basically compensate for the US withdrawal and therefore ensure that Iran still gets its end of the bargain, which, to put it very simply, was supposed to be economic relief. So Iran agreed to scale down the scope of its nuclear program, scale up the inspections on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief and economic relief. The latter didn't materialize. So Iran then, from 2019 onwards, started its own gradual, let's call it nuclear escalation. Sounds more spectacular than it actually is. But escalating on the JCPOA file in order to exert pressure on the remaining parties. The logic here really is that Tehran tried, through strategic patience, as I mentioned earlier, to say, okay, we will abide by the agreement in spite of the US having left and violated it. But after a year, they realized that there is nothing they get out of it, which is why they then decided to exert pressure by gradually scaling down the commitment to the obligations posed by the JCPOA. Now, the JCPOA has not collapsed, and the crucial point that still exists is the inspections regime by the IAEA, which is still happening on the ground in Iran's nuclear sites. It continues to be the most comprehensive inspection regime under the auspices of the IAEA and in accordance to the NPT, in accordance to the additional protocol of the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the one thing that is at stake right now is that Iran is now exerting some pressure on the newly inaugurated Biden administration to move fast on returning what Trump has unleashed on Iran. And since that pace is too slow for the Iranian side, we're at a situation where Iran is trying to put up some deadlines, one deadline being next week. We will certainly speak about it, to see whether the US will, or the Biden administration will promise to unpack the sanctions regime imposed on Iran by Trump. And I think this is where we're standing right now. We're seeing a Biden administration and a team around Joe Biden that is beyond doubt willing to restore the JCPOA. What is unclear until this moment, however, is how exactly that is done, how much domestic costs is the Biden administration willing to pay to return to the JCPOA. And Iran has made it clear that the US has to move first. And to be fair, it actually makes sense because the US left the deal first. But there needs to be a roadmap, and to close on that point, for that roadmap, the Iranian foreign minister has basically called on the High Representative of the European Union, Josep Borrell, to help. Iran did not invite the Europeans to mediate between Iran and Washington, but rather to outline a roadmap for the return to JCPOA compliance on both the American and the Iranian side. I think I'll leave it at that. We'll have plenty of more opportunities to dive deeper into the case.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for setting the scene from the agreement of the Iran nuclear deal in April 2015, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan for Action, JCPOA. And that was struck between the 5 permanent members, one of which, of course, of the UN Security Council plus Germany. So the US within the mix there too. So thank you very much for giving that overview of the perspective from Iran and how Iran might be seeing it, as well as some of the wider dynamics. So Dr. Bianco, over to you next. How about a European perspective? So how do you see it from the EU's perspective?
So good evening, everyone. I think here it's important to first qualify what counts as a European perspective. There are several. There is the perspective of the European Union, and then there is the perspective of the so-called E3, which is a group formed by the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. It's a subgroup of European countries, of course. And then there are a number of other European member states of the EU, who have their own perspective on Iran, notably, for instance, Italy. So let's try to briefly outline all of those different ideas. The European Union was one of the most active members of the Commission that promoted the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal. The European Union acts as a coordinator of that group of the P5+1, and is very much working to support the US to return to the JCPOA, because it always has viewed the JCPOA as not only a fundamental deal Iran from getting nuclear weapons, but also a fundamental first step towards regional stability in the Gulf writ large, and thirdly, as a personal diplomatic achievement of the EU. So that is quite a clear position from the European Union. Then there is the E3. And we have to say that the 3 perspectives of the UK, France, and Germany have been, broadly speaking, very aligned in the past. They have been quite active in negotiating the JCPOA in the beginning. They have been supportive of what they call critical engagement with Iran, which means that vis-a-vis, for instance, the EU, they are more ready and more willing to call out Iran when they feel that there is a break of the agreement, or there are steps by Iran that don't show enough goodwill. And that's a position that we are seeing consolidating right now, because we can say that the E3 has been more vocal than the EU, and also trying to put some pressure on Iran, while at the same time still advocating for the need to go back to the deal. Then there are other European nations, and I mentioned Italy specifically because Italy is one of the countries in the EU that is most interested in developing, not only in going back to the JCPOA, but developing all of the possible follow-on economic benefits from the deal. There is a historical engagement between Italy and Iran, and there is, broadly speaking, an engagement that goes also beyond the simple economic and trade factor, and sees, for instance, some instances of dialogue with Iran on geopolitical issues such as Afghanistan or even Yemen. So to really coordinate all of these different standpoints is, of course, not easy, but the Europeans are trying to do that, and they are trying to figure out how they can support the US in going back into the deal, mindful of the implication on domestic politics for the United States. Of course, the Biden administration now seems very much interested in basically refuting whatever the Trump represented in the 4 years of his presidency. At the same time, they still have to navigate quite a controversial environment in their own domestic politics. And both with the Democrats and the Republicans are staunch opponents to this deal and to diplomacy with Iran in general. So we are going to see, I think, a quite interesting positioning from the different European voices, trying to balance and counterbalance the positions of the other players, first and foremost the US and Iran, and then at the second level also Russia and China. So for instance, it's, I think, perfectly normal to see that a European player like France is more outspoken of the need to include the regional players such as Israel and Saudi Arabia in potential negotiations with Iran, while we see that other players, especially the EU, are much more cautious and would like and are just promoting a simple return to the JCPOA as a first stepping stone to wider regional talks on security in the Gulf. This is, I think, intended as a balance and counterbalance geopolitical approach that would be able to, by pushing different buttons and pressure points, try to combine the different inputs without leading to escalation and backlashes of maybe too hasty return to the deal without taking into consideration other implications. And I pass on the floor and very happy to elaborate further.
Thank you very much for elaborating on the multifaceted nature of what European means indeed, so E3 and the EU angle there. So thank you very much for that. So next I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Krieg. Could you maybe expand a little bit on the Qatari angle, because Qatar announced that it is prepared to mediate between Tehran and the Gulf states to enable a deal to be struck that could last. So Dr. Krieg, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and great to being among friends here. So if you look at the Qatari approach to this, obviously Qatar has always been very supportive of the JCPOA from the beginning. It never thought it was a good idea, unlike some of the neighbors, that to withdraw from the deal. Qatar has always been having a special relationship with Iran, different from Saudi Arabia, different from the UAE. It has always been quite pragmatic in seeing this engagement with Iran as a win-win approach. They always thought that there was more to win by collaborating and engaging Iran proactively rather than confronting them. That has obviously caused a lot of friction, a lot of problems within the GCC. The Gulf crisis that somewhat came to an end in January kind of was also a symptom of obviously Qatar's engagement and relationship with the Iranians. But the countries believe in a shared neighborhood. They understand that obviously just the physical proximity to Iran means that any escalation with Iran, whether within the region or coming from outside, such as from the United States, is obviously counterproductive and will inevitably affect their own security. And obviously, let's not forget that there's a massive joint maritime border that they have with Iran, and obviously beyond that, they jointly extract gas from the North Field. Hence, there is obviously collaboration on that field. So that being said, the countries have always advocated for what is a collective approach to the JCPOA. And they always feel that Iran, in comparison to, for example, the UAE or especially Saudi Arabia, Iran is less of a tangible threat to Qatari security than some of its neighbors. And if you look at the history of Qatar over the last 30 years, then you see that especially the Saudis have probably posed more of a challenge to the Qataris than the Iranians have effectively. And I think that is something that in the psyche of most Qataris still plays a very important role. So it's still not it's a friendly relationship, but it's not one of necessarily an alliance or a partnership, because is how it has been presented many times in the media. Because I think genuine trust between Tehran and Doha is somewhat still lacking. There is engagement, there is talk, but that relationship is still one where, many years ago, there was an interesting quote by Hamad bin Jassim, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar, where he was saying, we lie to them, they lie to us. And that kind of still, kind of wraps up how the countries are looking at the Iranians. It's a pragmatic relationship. It's a relationship out of necessity, not necessarily one where, there is a lot of ideational synergy between the two. And I think that kind of brings us to the JCPOA. And for them, the Qataris has always been a very important milestone. They understand that security in the region is based on a collective multilateral approach to engaging Iran, as well as engaging Iran in the wider Middle East, but also especially in the Gulf. And I think there is a vision in Qatar now to kind of draw in the Iranians into a joint, a trans-Gulf framework, if you will, and that obviously seems to be kind of very idealistic if we look at it from where we stand at the moment, obviously, because especially Saudi, but also the Emiratis obviously would not embrace such an approach. The Iranians have made an offer, again, coming from the current government, an offer to kind of build something that they called Hope, kind of bringing all the Gulf states together. I think we're very, very much far away from this. But for the Qataris, as for the Emiratis and the Saudis as well, to an extent, there is this fear that obviously if if maximum pressure continues, if sanctions continue to put pressure on the Iranians, that eventually Iran will act out because they have no other option, no other way to make their voices heard. And hence why they think that the dangers of kind of leaving the JCPOA and not trying to re-engage Iran, the dangers of that will be more escalation, as we've seen in the summer of 2019, as we've seen after the killing of Soleimani in January 2020. So the fear is that, if you don't engage and Iran continues more of its sub-threshold operations in Iraq or in Yemen, or even, in the maritime domain in the Gulf, there will be direct threats to infrastructure and critical waterways that will be critical not just for the Qataris, but for the wider GCC. And I think that's the approach that the Qataris have taken. They always want de-escalation, and their outreach to the Iranians over the last 18 months or so, even longer than that, all the way back to summer 2019, after we've seen some of these tanker attacks that were attributed to the Iranians. Much of what happened there is about de-escalation. The Qataris wanted to establish a direct link, and that direct link is not necessarily about mediating between the US and the Iranians, which is obviously something that the Qataris are very happy to do, but I don't think, they haven't been asked formally yet by the Americans to do that, but they're offering that. But I think it's more about, quite tangibly, about de-escalation and kind of trying to establish a way to speak to Tehran amid regional tensions. This is more about trying to establish a communication link between the GCC, the Arab Gulf states, and Iran, rather than the Americans and Iran. And I think that's where it goes. The Qataris do promote itself as an interlocutor. They want to return to a new agreement. The way that the new agreement might look like, I think the Qataris are quite flexible on this. They do understand, though, that there is more of a danger, and they, that a new Iran deal might not be sufficient if it just touches upon the nuclear deal and obviously certain thresholds of enrichment. And they do understand that some of the activities that Iran has engaged in, whether it's in Iraq or in Yemen, some of these surrogate operations might be problematic as well, and might need to be covered as well in some sort of deal. And that's why I think the countries are trying to find means and ways to offer the Iranians more, in order to allow the Iranians to kind of withdraw some of their their pressure from some of the pressure points in the region, rather than just talking about the nuclear deal, because the nuclear deal in itself is not a huge problem for the Qataris. It's not about the fear of a nuclear Iran, because it's obviously the more conventional activity that Iran is engaged in or could get involved in. If pressure is mounting, that is more of a threat to Qatar than the actual fear of a nuclear weapon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having touched on the role of Qatar, but also some of those regional dynamics and pressure points. And I think that leads on beautifully to Sami Hamdi. Sami, so can we dive into those regional dynamics a bit more, some of those pressure points? Saudi Arabia has been arguing that any negotiations with Iran should seek to curb rather than recognize what they would consider to be Tehran's expansive influence in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. So what are the key issues in the region, and how can we expect these to impact the negotiations?
First of all, thanks to Middle East Dialogue Center for hosting. Thanks to the esteemed colleagues for sharing a panel with me. Thank you, Neva, for hosting, and thanks to the 6 or 7 odd pages of people who've participated. I'm on the phone, so I can't scroll and see who's there, but I think I saw William Law there as well. So hi, William. I think it's important that to stress there are two narratives that are running concurrent or in parallel to one another with regards to the Iran nuclear deal. There is the narrative that is in Europe and the US, this idea that a deal is a good thing. It's time to talk with Iran. It's time for dialogue. It's time to come together to establish a framework within which there can be the pursuit of mutual interest that will be to the economic and political benefit of both. And then there is the narrative in the region, where if you speak to many people in the region, they will say that this is in essence the US abandoning the Arabs, deciding to share power with the Iranians, splitting the government of Iraq, splitting the government of Yemen, trying to come to some sort of arrangement in Syria, and trying to come to some sort of negotiation or arrangement with Iran in Lebanon, whereby the US will allow Iran to expand its interests, to look after its interests, in exchange that Iran no longer targets US interests and continues to operate within a boundary that will be set by these negotiations that are operating under the prospect of the nuclear deal. And we're seeing it in Yemen, for example, whereby Linda King has been appointed as the US envoy to Yemen, whereby Martin Griffiths was immediately sent to Tehran, which was an acknowledgement of Iran's role in Yemen, which Iran has denied for a long time. It's denied that it has a major role in Yemen, but Martin Griffiths has essentially gone to the Iranians, and there's only really one reason for this visit, which is to tell the Iranians, let's talk, let's discuss Yemen. And if we look at that practically, let's not look at it in terms of theory. If we look at it practically, the only way in which you could facilitate genuine dialogue between the US and Iran with regards to issues such as Yemen and Iraq is by acknowledging the various different established power structures, whether that's via US military bases or US military presence, whether that's via Iran's militias. In practical terms, this means that in Yemen, the solution or the impact of the nuclear talk negotiations on Yemen is a hukumat muhasasa. It's a government that is divided based on power, based on factions, because the Houthis are not going to give up Sana'a, they're not going to give up Hudaydah. So it's more about a government that is negotiated between Iran, i.e. the Houthis, and between the US through the various different other factions, whether it's pressuring the UAE to push the STC into forming a government. And this is the dangerous narrative, in that the Iran nuclear deal is being seen in the region amongst many of those who are actually involved, the actors in the region, that it is an overwhelming victory for Iran, in that the US now is trying to resolve the regional issues and the security issues pragmatically, not democratically. In Yemen, it's no longer about restoring the national dialogue. It's about superimposing a government and saying to the Houthis, you took Sana'a, we're not interested in removing you, therefore we will recognize you and give you power, and Iran inadvertently benefits from that. In Iraq, it's about, we're not necessarily interested in pushing out the Iranian militias. We don't want to exert those resources. US public opinion is not in favor of it. The Iranians have supported us in our fight against ISIS. You'll remember that in 2014, Obama had to lean on the Iranian-backed militias in order to push back against ISIS because the Iraqi army was very impotent. And as a result, there was this developed framework whereby Obama compromised and essentially said to the Iranians, if you can convince the militias to join the Iraqi army, i.e. join the government institution and framework, then we're happy to deal with you on this basis, essentially granting greater control of the security of Iraq to the Iranians. This doesn't necessarily mean that dialogue is a bad thing or that dialogue is wrong, but it's important that when we're talking about the European aspect, the reason why Europe has been ineffective so far in many of the regional issues is because Europe does not look at the region in the way the Americans do. The Americans look at the realpolitik power structures in the region, while the EU tends to look at the more idealistic concepts of trying to come to some sort of dialogue and framework within this Iran nuclear deal. The US says that Iran has power, militias have power, and I need to deal with that, and I'm going to deal with that by recognizing that power, and that everybody else, whether it's the Islah, whether it's the Kurds in Iraq, whether it's these other different factions, are too weak to force themselves onto the table. So essentially they will follow orders as opposed to being genuine participants in this particular dialogue. And that's one of the reasons Iran is rejecting Saudi Arabia's participation in the dialogue, because there are two main reasons for this. The first is that Iran legitimately believes that Saudi should have no right to dictate the future of its people in asserting whether or not sanctions should be lifted. And I am a big advocate against sanctions. I believe that irrespective of the differences, people should not be punished for whatever views people might have about the regime, and the Iranian people have suffered the most when it comes to sanctions. Sanctions should be lifted as swiftly as possible. So Iran is right, but Iran is also rejecting Saudi participation because it knows that for Saudi, for the UAE, for the Gulf states, their buy-in in terms of the deal, they will listen to what Washington tells them. Their leverage is very weak. Mohammed bin Salman has released Lujain al-Hathlul. He's making all of these various different reforms desperately trying to align with Biden because he fears for his own future. So Iran is not worried about Saudi capability of scuppering this deal. Of course, this naturally begs the question, why is France insisting, Macron insisting on including Saudi Arabia and the UAE? My take on it is quite simply that when you look at the 2015 JCPOA, it was very much negotiated almost exclusively by the US and by Iran with some input from Europe. And you'll remember that for those of you who were following the deal at the time, that 2 days before the signing of the agreement, there were rumors that France was going to refuse to sign it on the basis that they had not been shown enough respect. I think what Macron is doing now is asserting that this time they will not be dragged by the Americans in this deal, that Europe will finally have a say. What Macron is doing, he's adopting the American approach of dealing with realpolitik. We are going to make things complicated for the Iranians so they do not go behind our backs and debate exclusively with the Americans. They must take us seriously. And this, of course, so we don't, there are a lot of doors probably that have been opened from the other participants as well. But to wrap up with regards to trying to bring it back towards Europe, it's important that if Europe wants to play a viable role in bringing about a deal, ignoring the other issues that I've mentioned, Europe must look at the region as it is, not how it thinks it is. It must look at the region as it is and not in terms of what it wants it to be or what it ideally would like the region to be. The nuclear deal or the negotiation with Iran is all about power dynamics. It's about the US saying, if you can't beat them, let's come up with a framework together whereby we will share power. And if Europe manages to adopt this approach, this leveraging of power in the negotiations, then they will be able to actually get the US to listen, to get Biden to listen, and to get Washington to listen, so that they might benefit the most with regards to the deal. I'd probably leave it there in terms of bringing up, but just to conclude on this, it's important to highlight that this, as Andreas said, and I 100% agree with him, in that this is not a negotiation solely about Iran's nuclear power. If anything, it's probably third, fourth, or fifth priority on the list. This is first and foremost a negotiation about how to establish a framework whereby the Americans and the Iranians can work together without antagonizing one another.
Working together without antagonizing one another, Sami, that's a fantastic sort of ending line there. Thank you very much for having given us your views on some of the regional dynamics, but also how some of the third parties from outside the region should be approaching it, whether it's the European side or the American approach. So thank you very much to our speakers. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you. I see one person's already done so. Just a quick reminder about how to ask questions. So at the bottom, you've got the reactions button. It's a nice smiley face that you'll see on the WebEx platform. So if you click on that, at the top, you should see the option that says raise hand. So if you're struggling with that in any way, shape or form, please don't hesitate to put your question into the chat and we can try to find you from there. So William Law, I will be asking you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question. Please keep your questions short so that we can get through as many as possible. William, the floor is yours. So I'm hoping you're able to unmute yourself. You should be great. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Terrific panel with some very thought-provoking thoughts. I wanted to ask about the Israelis, because the Israelis are big players in this. They have an inside track, even though it's somewhat damaged with the Biden administration. I think that's still a strong player, Israeli and American relations. There have been conversations, certainly in Tel Aviv, that the Israelis might even launch a military strike just to prevent the JCPOA from getting off the ground again. I'm just wondering from the panel what their thoughts are on Israel, and also with normalization, the degree to which some of these Gulf states could influence Israel should they attempt something as provocative as a strike to derail the JCPOA being revived. Thank you.
William, thank you very much for that very clear question. So, role of Israel in a JCPOA 2.0. Who would like to take the floor? Dr. Krieg, so Andreas, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm just going to start this off. So I do think that we, in all of that, in all of what we've discussed now, there's a lot of narrative involved. This is it's for the most part an information campaign, right? It's about influencing others to change their behavior, and deterrence plays a very important role in this, or we should say information operations play a very important role in deterrence. And everything that we see coming out of Tehran, what we see coming out of the Gulf states, as well as what we see coming out of Tel Aviv or Israel, should also first and foremost be seen as deterrence, as information operations, psyops, in support of trying to achieve some sort of diplomatic outcome that might be in favor of one's own position. So I think Israel, and what Israel has done so far, is also, especially when it comes from the Netanyahu government, a lot of it is based on politics and strategic communication. That being said, however, if you look at the actions taken by Israel more recently, with an F-35 jet flying into Iranian territory, obviously the killing of Farizadeh, and so, which most likely been, we can attribute to the Israelis, shows that the Israelis have taken a confrontational approach. They've taken a confrontational approach to the Biden administration more widely. But would Israel actually fear, or would Israel actually take the risk of a full-out military confrontation with Iran? Most likely not. If you speak to people in the military intelligence or within the security sector in Israel, they would also highly recommend against any first strike against Iran, because we're not at that point yet. Last week we saw the military intelligence releasing in Israel the report about the most imminent threats to Israel, physical threats to Israel, and Iran was certainly, with its proxy network, was certainly featuring in there. And there was a assessment being made that probably Israel, that if Iran was putting its mind to, they could be a nuclear power, they could have a nuclear warhead within 24 months. But you know what, when I lived in Israel for, which is more than 10 years ago, they already had these kind of anticipations when they were saying, Iran is only away 5 years away, 2 years away, 1 year away. These are all deadlines. They've all been passed, and Iran hasn't gone nuclear. So, we should always take this with a lot of pinch of salt, because, as I said, this is strategic communication. So, that being said, however, I think Israel is looking in its outreach to the Gulf at new opportunities to actually get back at Iran. And most of it will happen under the threshold of war. And I think this is very important to understand everything that happened in the confrontation, because we'll be constantly talking about an escalation with Iran, we're going to war with Iran. If you ask me, we're already at war with Iran. The West is at war, America is at war with Iran, and the Arab Gulf states are at war with Iran, because this is a sub-threshold conflict. That means we will never go into international armed conflict, because all sides don't want that sort of escalation, but that leaves plenty of room for escalation in other domains. So surrogate operation is something we mentioned, whether it's through militias in Iraq or in Syria, whether it's indirectly through the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's through IRGC special ops in the maritime domain in the Gulf, or in fact cyber operations. And we've seen plenty of these being used by both sides, the Americans, the Israelis, but also the Iranians on the other side. So that leaves quite a lot of scope, as long as we don't actually go crossing that threshold into a major armed conflict, or major combat operations. Seems to be a fairly sustainable stalemate, but it's constantly obviously on the knife's edge. And obviously we want to bring it down. And I think there is an interest here, what I was talking about from the Qatari point of view, but also from a Saudi and Emirati point of view, to kind of bring that escalation down a bit, so that we're not constantly on the knife's edge. Because obviously whenever you play along the threshold rather than very much below the threshold, but you're kind of playing along the threshold of war, you're kind of playing with fire that could cause an eruption at any point, and obviously that needs to be avoided. So if Israel has seized opportunities here, working with the Emiratis, obviously in Yemen, we've seen some outreach with the STC and some military intelligence in southern Yemen. Again, that has something to do with countering some of Iranian operations there. Then there are constant strikes against Iranian infrastructure in Syria that will continue in the same way that any strike that any kind of operation from Hezbollah's side in southern Lebanon is also something where, again, the Israelis will take action. These are operational actions. These are not strategic in any way. It's, again, keeping it below a certain threshold. And I think opportunity with the Gulf states are as well to use Abu Dhabi as a hub to actually, for espionage and activities into Iran proper. And I think that there are a lot of opportunities and synergies that are being developed. I mean, this whole normalization thing is not something that happened yesterday or last year. This is something that's been going on for more than a decade. And these interrelationships, these security sector relationships between the UAE and Israel are quite solid. And obviously, Iran is one of these targets. But as you rightly say, the UAE have no interest in a major escalation in the same way that the Saudis don't have an interest in that. But there's a lot more they can do. I mean, there's obviously delivery of the Iron Dome a system to Saudi Arabia. That's a major movement in that direction, because we haven't touched upon the ballistic missile program. Is another major threat that I can't see the Iranians ever giving up, because it's such an important game changer in insurance policy. But then if you can't cause the Iranians to give it up, then at least you can do as much as you can to prevent that from ever becoming an asset that can be used. So I think, again, here, Israel, the procurement of Israeli technology, procurement of Israeli know-how is something that Israel will deliver to the Gulf as a way to kind of counter Iran. But again, all of this staying below the threshold of war.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive view. We're definitely talking about a complicated region, but through events like this, we can unpack those complications and break it down into easy and digestible knowledge nuggets, I like to call them. So Adnan, I'm very sorry, I am slightly struggling to pronounce your surname correctly, so I'm just going to go with your first name if that's okay, and please do excuse me for that. But please, I think you wanted to add something.
Yes, please don't worry about the last name. I was wondering where you got that L, but no problem at all. All good. I can imagine your name has also its challenges, but I will just pronounce it Sadikoglu and prove that I am able of pronouncing it. Okay.
Gosh, and I've been put to shame definitely on that one. So
no, please don't worry.
I will be
at
practicing till next time to make sure I get it perfect.
Don't worry at all, please. No, I would actually like to build on what Andreas very eloquently already put out there. The Israeli position has certainly become more, I mean, on the one hand, more explicit in the past couple of years. It has also become a bit more cynical. I think I am by no means a Israel expert, or let's say an expert in messaging coming from Israel, but in the way that I have been following statements on Iran, I felt that on different ways the rhetoric has become more aggressive. I don't want to say more sinister, because that's, in politics, many things are sinister. But just to give you an example, Benjamin Netanyahu at some point started to speak about the Islamic State of Iran, no longer about the Islamic Republic, just trying to inset this idea, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and the Islamic State of Iran is one and the same thing. And because this reference was often made, and these are some of the messaging techniques and routines that I felt were coming in the past years. I think this idea, what Andreas mentioned about the sub-threshold war is spot on, because indeed, we have Israelis assassinating top Iranian nuclear scientists in the past decade. There were 5 to 6 of them, the latest one and last year with Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. I think in the first 2 weeks of this year, I have lost count of the number of airstrikes the Israelis carried out in Syria, presumably on Iranian forces, with Iranian forces actually being killed. Plus the way that Israeli policies, Israeli intelligence feeds into other activities, operations that can be put into the sub-threshold warfare, be it, for example, the allegation from Tehran that the attack on, that the explosion in the nuclear site of Natanz in August last year was basically carried out by the Israelis. And this is a whole list of operations, some of them psyops or info warfare, others actual deadly action. And I have to say, given the lack of response from the Iranian side, which is, in my belief, a clear assessment of Iran's own strategic limits, plus the lack of, let's also put it frankly, lack of condemnation for some of these acts. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think the UAE were the only state to actually really condemn the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. The EU, for example, spoke about a criminal act, but fell short of criminalizing or condemning it. And this is the reason I'm listing these things up, just to say that I think the Israeli strategy will just continue to be this, because it is not very costly. And I don't think that there is this idea that we would need an overt airstrike. And I'm not even sure about the F-35 jet over Tehranian skies. I heard about it, but I mean, Andreas, if you know more about whether that was really the case or whether it was a rumor, that would be good to know. But so there is no need for Israel to change the strategy. And as a final thought, this goes back to the point of strategic communication that Andreas mentioned. Two more points on that. First, if I put myself in the shoes of European policymakers, Cinzia is more qualified to speak about that. If I am worried about Israel striking Iran, I might be happy as a European politician with less action carried out by the Israelis on Iran, so that there is less the danger of a major escalation. So that kind of threat is also imposed on European policymakers, I can imagine. And then there is one interesting domestic Israeli point that I read in a Haaretz article recently, which said that the statements made by Kochavi to say we will strike Iran in case of a simple resumption of the nuclear agreement might also be an attempt by him to raise the budget for the IDF in the upcoming state budget. So more or less a domestic messaging that obviously has its external impact, but there might also be a notion to that. I think in a nutshell, I'm trying to say, in the lines of what Andreas said, this is a lot about messaging. This is a lot about messaging towards the US, towards the Europeans. And there is also some internal dimension to it, but I don't see that kind of past operations, most of them being extremely covert and deniable, shifting into something else. Back to you, Neva.
Neva, can I?
Hi, of course, Sami. I see we have one more question, but please go ahead. And then I'll also ask Cinzia if she would also like to make a comment, please.
I just want to make two quick points. I think the points made by Andreas and Adnan are on point. I won't delve into that. The point I want to make is this: is that Israel, Saudi Arabia railed against the original Iran deal, the JCPOA, during negotiations and when it was signed. They did not like the fact it was signed. They did not like it at all. They sought to jeopardize it and lobby against it. That didn't stop the US signing eventually a deal with Iran, and it did not get Iran to. Iran did not respond to those provocations. Iran believes this deal is fundamental, and I don't think Iran is keen on responding to any provocation. And we saw the way that it essentially didn't respond to Trump's provocations in his final year. So in other words, I think that while Israel may try to make it difficult to reach a deal with Iran, I think Iran really wants this deal, and so do the US and so do the Europeans. And I think this is very important in terms of how the challenges will eventually be overcome. The second point I want to make is with regards to Trump's impeachment. Trump was an enabler in the region. Trump enabled the blockade on Qatar. Trump enabled the withdrawal from the JCPOA. Trump enabled a lot of the heightened antagonism that we saw against Iran through the maximum pressure policy. From what I've read, the Republicans failed to impeach him, and now there's hashtags going around, Trump 2024 and the like. And there are analyses that when you look at them, nobody really wants to rule out the prospect that Trump might run again, or at least somebody, or might back a candidate to run again. And I think that while it seems far-fetched, the point that I want to make is, one, the Americans, while they might be influenced by Israel, Israel will not be the deciding factor in any way with regards to pursuing a deal with Iran. But two, there is this question mark that is very quiet. It's barely a whisper at the moment. But after the US midterm elections, in which it will become clearer to what extent the Trump factor still lingers in US politics, I think there is a sentiment in that while we are looking at the current challenges in pursuing a deal, there's no guarantee that any deal that gets signed with Iran now stands a better chance of lasting than the one signed before.
Thank you very much, Sami. So Trump was an enabler of regional complications, if I can summarize it that way. That was an interesting point being made. Yeah, thank you very much for the very valuable addition there. Cinzia, would you like to make an addition? And after that, I will be giving the floor to Iham Saif Eddin. So, Cinzia, if you would like to take the floor, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm passing the floor now to Iham Saif Eddin.
Yeah, thank you, Neva, and thanks for all the panelists for these rich interventions. I'm just wondering that it sounds that future negotiations towards the full return to the JCPOA will be most likely very challenging and complicated. However, I'm wondering if parallel talks about regional security issues between Tehran and its neighbors are feasible at the moment, and whether the EU has a potential role to play in this regard. Thank you.
So, Cinzia, I feel like that was almost specifically planned for you in mind, keeping in mind that you were going to come in. So, Cinzia, what about the EU angle and the regional security deals indeed? If there's anything you want to add also in the Israeli dynamics, please feel free to do so.
Thank you very much. And I think we've touched basically the two hottest questions, especially from a European point of view, let me say, because so the normalization deals with Israel have definitely changed the narrative about, at least about the UAE in a few specific European policy circles. And I'm referring even to policy circles that normally are not interested in foreign policy. For example, the national parliaments. There have been conversations on the record and off the record that really highlighted how parliamentarians, parties, and officials have reconsidered or put into question their thinking about the UAE after the deal to normalize relations with Israel. And this is why I've often described that normalization deal as very much oriented towards strengthening the positioning of the UAE, not only in Washington, where of course it has played a huge role, both with the Trump administration and the Biden administration, but also in Europe. So the Europeans are now, as we speak, interested in finding out if those deals can be expanded to other players in the Arab region. And albeit they are very clear, and here I stress in particular the European Union is extremely clear that the Israel-Palestine issue has to be dealt with separately, and the right of the Palestinians to their own state will come first. They still look at the normalization as divided from the Middle East peace process, but very important in the long-term stabilization of the region. Now we can agree, or we can of course disagree about that. Definitely, we have to acknowledge that they see in the same way regional talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia in particular, but in general in the Gulf. So, for instance, the European Union, again, specifically, has been thinking about options to put together these regional talks with specific reference to Iraq, and then at a later stage, Yemen, because of the European Union's clear interest in the stability, in the long-term stability of Iraq, and their involvement in post-war reconstruction and possibly some economic development and growth. Again, here we have perhaps to underline some differences with some key European countries. And I want to go back briefly to France, because I think that what sometimes escapes our analysis is that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, he is a provocateur. He likes to steer the waters. He doesn't necessarily mean everything he says. He won't be necessarily strategically involved into trying to make sure that Israel and Saudi Arabia have a seat at the table, at the same table of Iran with the JCPOA talks. He just likes to push the ball rolling, to steer the waters, to provoke, to push buttons, because he sometimes is convinced that, you know, the status quo is in the status quo. Players are too entrenched in their positions. And he believes many times, has made that clear in speeches, if you look at the nuances, that what it really means with his provoking comments is that the status quo is too unchangeable and too unproductive. That's the same thing that happened with, if you recall, with his very famous comment about NATO, when he called NATO brain dead. That didn't mean that France suddenly stopped being engaged in NATO or trying to revitalize some of the dossiers that were of specific strategic interest for France. It just wanted to steer the conversation and move other players from their positions. This is a game he plays also with the European Union and with some of his European colleagues, in particular in Germany, because the European Union and Germany are two players that are very slow in adapting to changes sometimes and very reticent to engage in bolder actions. The kind of which might be needed to, for instance, start a regional security dialogue between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And here I come very quickly to the key question of how can the Europeans help put together this dialogue. I've written a paper for the European Council on Foreign Relations, which you will, I apologize, you will excuse me for linking it in the chat later, but basically I've argued that indeed, the status quo makes it almost impossible to come to the table and discuss questions of geopolitics and hard security, like Yemen, like finding a balance of power in Iraq between the Saudi influence and the Iranian influence. And at the same time, it's going to be very much necessary. It's also going to be very much necessary to agree not only on the security architecture of the region, but on a security guarantor that can be accepted by all parties and perceived as non-threatening. And so one of the ideas that I've launched in the paper is that, for instance, the Europeans should build on an existing mission on maritime security called the European Maritime Awareness in the Strait of Hormuz mission, and expand this mission that now counts only 8 or 9 European countries to wider scope and also wider capabilities to, for instance, guarantee at least the maritime security between the two sides, and in that way provide some kind of peace of mind to the GCC side, which is of course used to having international powers guaranteeing their security. And whatever I agree with Iran, they will want international players to be guarantors of that in a way, but at the same time use an avenue that lessens the threat perceptions from Iran, because, for instance, the twin mission, the one led by the United States on maritime security, called the International Maritime Security Construct, that is a very Trump-esque mission, conceived by Trump, put together by Trump, and led by very Trump-like thinking, might very well be disbanded, and therefore you might have a reduction of US military presence in the Gulf and an increase of European presence there, which hopefully would lessen the threat perceptions in Tehran. Thanks.
Cinzia, thank you very much for that comprehensive overview. You also received a question in the chat, which I'm going to read out. So it says, Dr. Bianco, you just said that Europeans have a different, more ideological approach to the region. Is this difference also partly due to their desire to become more independent of the US in terms of security? I mean, it's less about the region than a US-EU thing. Cinzia, would you like to come in on that? Let's see if we can manage to unmute you. Hopefully that's going to work. Cinzia, sorry, we're not hearing you.
there is definitely that dimension of European-US relations, and the Europeans are indeed working on strategic autonomy, but the Gulf is not one of those areas. It doesn't really have much to do with the Saudi-Iranian dynamics or with the Iraq or Yemen dynamics. The conversation about strategic autonomy in Europe is still very young. And if you will see that develop, you should look to the immediate neighborhood of Europe. You should look to Libya, you should look to Eastern Europe. That's where that really makes a difference. Further than that, I'm afraid we are very, very far away from even thinking about a strategic autonomous role for Europe.
Thank you very much. So are there any other questions from the floor? Because otherwise I might use my prerogative as moderator to ask a question myself, which it looks like I will have the opportunity to do so. I would love to hear all of your thoughts on how you feel COVID-19 is impacting the current dynamics. So we saw the media talking a lot about how COVID was impacting Iran and how that might be impacting the discourse, not only in Iran, but also in some of the other countries who who play a key role within the Iran nuclear deal talks, such as UK, for example. So the UK media was reporting quite a bit on the impact that COVID-19 was having in Iran, and perhaps the need to be a bit more lenient. So how do you feel the COVID-19 situation is impacting the possibility of a JCPOA 2.0?
Is it to me?
Cinzia, go for it.
Okay, thanks. I think that, COVID-19 actually has increased the urgency to go back to the JCPOA, and that's speaking of European thinking. And that's been the case. It's one of those very rare occasions where everyone agrees in Europe, in the sense that in the different European capitals and in Brussels, there is the issue of the urgency of tackling the pandemic has just renewed the calls for cooperation and diplomacy, and really go back to the JCPOA and use that as a first step for a broader dialogue, given how Iran has been very badly affected by the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. Sami, would you like to add anything?
I think the COVID-19 debate comes under the idea to what extent we believe that the Iranian people should be punished as a result of the political machinations of the international players that are competing with one another, whether it be the US or the government in Tehran or Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or the like. To what extent we believe or we see that the sanctions that have been implemented on Iran, like they've been implemented on Sudan or elsewhere, the number one victim has not been the regime, the number one victim has been the Iranian people. So I think the COVID-19 discussion comes into this, into what extent, now that we've seen the way COVID-19 has ravaged economies, the way it's ravaged populations around the world, not differentiating between developing countries or developed countries, to what extent it's time to look at a different approach towards Iran. And I think this is the emphasis perhaps that, given to time constraints and lack of eloquence, I was unable to get to in the original intervention, in the sense that what's taking place in the wider negotiations is this idea of let's try another approach with Iran, because the current approach is not working, because the current approach has seen Iran expand into Yemen, it's seen Iran expand into Iraq, in Syria and Lebanon. This sanctions and maximum pressure is quite simply not working, and we're not interested in going to war and sending boots on the ground towards the Iranians, and therefore there needs to be a very different approach. And I think this is why that when it comes to the COVID-19 debate, I think this feeds into this, in that when Iran is saying let's lift sanctions first and then let's talk, I think even when we're looking at the aims of what we want to achieve with these negotiations, in my view, success is not necessarily in reaching a comprehensive deal with Iran that deals with the security of the region or that deals with its nuclear activities or the like. A successful deal is one in which tangible steps are taken, within which there is an established framework of dialogue, which at least you can build on later on, because each country has its own individual unique dynamics. In Yemen, for example, if you really want to upset the Iranians, just arm the Islah and let them go and try and take Al-Hudaydah, and suddenly you have a new dynamics in the discussions with Iran. In Iraq, for example, they took out Qasem Soleimani once if they take out another general. Not that I'm advocating it, but I'm saying is in there are unique country-specific dynamics that alter the dynamics of the debate with Iran in various different issues. But I think for the success in the short term and perhaps the medium term, we'll see a relief on the Iranian people, at least as a result of COVID-19 and as a result of the lifting of sanctions. And I think this is what should be the focus for Europe in its discussions with Iran, as opposed to the security issues, which, if I'm brutally honest, EU has very, very little leverage to argue anything with regards to any of the outstanding issues that will be monopolized primarily by the US and Iran on the table.
So, Andreas, do you agree?
Partially, yes. I mean, there are two aspects I want to mention. I mean, for one, the COVID-19 crisis had a major impact on stability in the region more widely. It had a major impact on socioeconomics, had a major impact on, obviously, public health, and has obviously created more instability than it has created stability. And obviously, instability in many ways favors those who are able to exploit it. And Iran has been fairly good in exploiting some of the vulnerabilities in the region. But that being said, obviously, Iran is very vulnerable as well. And we mentioned that. I mean, it's a country that was particularly hard hit by COVID-19. It had an impact on social conscience and the relationship between society and the regime as well. It's not really one that brought more stability to Iran, but it has actually exacerbated some of the insecurity paradigms that we see within the regime or within Iran. And that, I think, is very dangerous, because it comes at a time when I think some of the hardliners are getting more and more grip on power in comparison to some of the more moderates in the country. So I think it compounds insecurity in the country, and that might lead Iran to take more extreme steps. The other aspect is, I think that the Europeans and the West more widely has been so preoccupied with themselves and their own economy. I mean, if you look at our priority lists in the UK and as well as in the EU, I don't think that Iran or the Middle East are anywhere in the top 5. And I think that will obviously shift the focus. If you look at public debate today, I don't think anybody's looking at Iran. I don't think anybody's looking at even more pressing issues. If you ask me, Libya or Syria, nobody's talking about these issues. So Iran is even further down that line. It hasn't been securitized enough to kind of galvanize public pressure into, on governments to take any actions on this. Surely there is an opportunity, but I don't think it's going to be for the foreseeable future. I'm saying 2021 and possibly by 2022 we can look at such issues. And let's have a look at the Biden administration. I mean, if you look at the individuals who've been appointed, they obviously take a very clear approach to Iran and the JCPOA, very much 180-degree shift from those people who were in charge of the Middle East in the Trump White House. But I think the difference here is that the Middle East, despite all this, is still not a number one focal point for the Biden administration. In terms of, obviously, domestic crisis comes first, and that's COVID, that's socioeconomics, that's domestic polarization. And then in addition to this, it's going to be Asia. It's going to be East Asia, not the Middle East, in terms of priorities. If you look at the list of who were called by, the new Secretary of State and how he started to reach out, if you look at that priority list, the Middle East didn't really feature there prominently, despite the fact that the first call of Biden would probably be to Bibi Netanyahu. Even there, the Israelis feel like they haven't really received that attention that they were due. So in all that context, I think, obviously we're all interested in the Middle East. We work on it. We think it's the most important thing you could ever talk about. But if you look at policy priorities in reality, I don't think the Middle East features very highly on this. And yes, for Biden, I think what happens with Iran is more important than what happens in the Arabian Gulf. It's more important than Syria, might be more important than Libya. But despite all this, it's still not going to see the investment of resources and time and institutional attention that it requires to actually get this off the ground. I think it's a gradual approach, and we shouldn't overstate, or we shouldn't overestimate how much the Americans are actually interested in getting this off the ground.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So, continuing on that theme, is COVID?
Sorry, Neva. Excuse me, Neva. If I just wanted to also build on this COVID-19.
So Adnan, I was coming exactly to you. So fantastic. Sorry. I don't have to frame the question. Straight over to you. You've saved me my few seconds. Please, Adnan.
It looked as if you want to do a transition to another topic, which is
Nope,
why
it was a transition to you, but you've made my job easier, so I'm grateful for that. Please,
okay.
floor is
I
yours.
feel we have this thing going on this evening. Okay, look, on the COVID-19 dimension, I think a few points and a few thoughts that I really think are important, which is why I'm imposing myself on this so relatively aggressively. The one thing is that in the immediate time of the outbreak, we actually saw a moment of solidarity. This moment of solidarity among some of the neighboring Persian Gulf monarchies didn't turn into a momentum of solidarity, but at least we saw Kuwait immediately allocating a $10 million fund to the Iranians. The Qataris basically offered its cargo fleet for free to fly medical equipment, etc., into Iran. And we even saw some significant badges of support coming from the UAE. So there was some regional moment of solidarity, which was positive, and I think this is something that will not be forgotten. It also, I think, has led to, and Andreas was alluding to it, I think, to some important socioeconomic dynamics in this region we're looking at. The necessity and the urgency Cinzia was referring to, I think, earlier, for some of these countries to somehow change and shift their view on their economic model, frankly speaking. This idea, and I heard that in an inner Iranian academic debate the other day, this idea of the need to develop regional multilateralism rather than trying to benefit from globalization. And I think this is very, very early on in the public discourse, but can potentially maybe lead to some positive developments. What has been extremely negative, however, and since we're looking at Europe with the center's main audience, what has been catastrophic in the Iranian public view, but also obviously on the political stage, has been this whole idea of the IMF loan. The International Monetary Fund in March or end February 2020 announced that there is a 50 billion fund, or maybe even more, for countries that are hit hardest by COVID-19. Iran being one of the first after China and Italy to be really hit hard, and for the first time after 63 years applied for a fund by this we want to emphasize this European institution. And up until this day, the 5 billion loan that the Iranians requested did not go through to Iran. Why? Because the US has designated the Iranian central bank as a terrorist entity, which doesn't allow any sort of banking transaction between the IMF and Tehran. And additionally, obviously, the board of the IMF wouldn't dare to, in fact, reject the US covert halt into granting that loan to Iran. And being in a pandemic, having a European institution which is putting out a humanitarian fund, and that fund being halted in times of a pandemic is something that really has changed a lot in some of my own interlocutors in Tehran, whom I fell short of arguing why Europe is still a place to look to for value-oriented policies. And we have Iran basically a prime example of a country where the state cannot afford to shut its economy down to save lives, because we have millions of people on day jobs who have to go out into the streets, street vendors, people selling goods in the metro or at marketplaces, etc. And the government simply did not have the money to be able to basically make sure that the people have something to live off during a lockdown. Obviously, things like corruption, mismanagement, all of that you can add to the economic malaise. There is no doubt about this. But this is something that the pandemic and COVID-19 has actually made worse, has exacerbated in how the Iranians, and I'm not only speaking about the political elite, I'm really speaking about some of the public perceptions, that has done a damage that it will hardly ever recover, or at least will take some years to recover. Yeah, I think that was what I wanted to add on the COVID-19 front.
No, thank you very much, Adnan. And it's very interesting to hear from you about the long-lasting impact of what has gone on around COVID-19 and the IMF loans in particular. So thank you very much for sharing your insights there. We got a question in the meantime in the chat as well, and I would just draw everyone's attention to the paper that Cinzia has shared. So please do have a look at that, a presentation of some thought-provoking ideas for how European countries together with the EU can help bring the JCC at the table of diplomacy with Iran. So please do click on that and read it when you would like. So the question we got in the chat is, to what extent can Iran's hardliners affect the sorry guys, let's try that again. To what extent can Iran's hardliners affect the progress of reviving the JCPOA? So basically Iran's hardliners and the impact they would have on getting a deal on the table. So Adnan, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, well, I think we have to keep in mind one thing. The JCPOA as such, the nuclear agreement, in my assessment, is not a partisan issue in Iran. When this agreement was signed, the entire political spectrum, there was a consensus that this deal is a good thing for the country. The how we get to that deal, how do we protect the deal, how do we restore the deal, is when some partisan and political tension come in. And I think it's also important for us to remember that when in 2017 we had presidential elections, and we will have presidential elections on 18th June this year again, in 2017, the opponents of the current president Hassan Rouhani, back then, Ebrahim Raisi and Ghalibaf, they claimed, or they basically pledged in their campaign, that they would protect the JCPOA as a national document, as an asnad milli, as something that is basically a national, I don't want to say accomplishment or achievement, that sounds too positive, but something that is not just championed by the sitting government, but actually by the entire system, by the entire nizam. So that means that even if we were to have a much more far-right government in place in Iran, election result in June, and then inauguration in August, the government being formed and approved by parliament by September, October, this does not necessarily mean that this will mean the end of the JCPOA, but rather the approach towards the JCPOA might change. The willingness to give concessions, which is already at 0 right now, might actually go to minus 500 by then. The position might be a bit tougher than now, but I don't think that it necessarily means the end of the JCPOA. And should the JCPOA be fully restored before summer, I also really don't see it being unpacked after this government's term, unlike what we saw in the US. So I think the JCPOA would survive. If it was to be restored, it will survive a government transition in Tehran.
Adnan, thank you very much for that insight. So I'm liking the optimism about, even if we got it in place before the summer, I think many of us around here would be quite positively pleased if it was in place before the summer. Fingers crossed. Sami, what do you think?
I think that it's important to put the debate في نصابها in its parameters, in the framework. It's important not to be Eurocentric in the way that we're talking about Iran with regards to the reformists and the hardliners. Not that I'm saying that this doesn't apply, but I'm saying that when we're talking about the nuclear deal, I agree entirely with Adnan in that when it comes to the national parties, or when you speak to the Iranians, there is a general consensus, an overwhelming consensus, that it's a good thing, albeit they believe it's a good thing for different reasons. One chunk of the Iranian society believe that it's a progress towards rehabilitation with the international community, and the other side believes that it's a symbol of Iran's rising power and that the US could not defeat the Iranians. So I think both sides, for different reasons, accept this. The reason why I started with this idea that we should not be Eurocentric is because it's important to remember who withdrew from the JCPOA. Who withdrew from the Iran deal? If we remember, Rouhani and Jawad Zarif were getting lambasted by hardliners in Iran for being accused of conceding too much for the sake of the deal. When Adnan is talking about this idea of how to get to the deal, I think this is a good example in that Jawad Zarif and Rouhani were being lambasted because they were seen as offering too much and not getting guarantees that the other side would fulfill their role. So when we're asking the question, will hardliners scupper the deal or scupper negotiations towards the deal, I think the reflection should be on the part of the other side in suggesting that, listen, we may not like these hardliners, but we gave them golden ammunition to argue that we could not be trusted. And that's why when it comes to Biden insisting that he will not lift sanctions on Iran, bear in mind, I'm on the fence on this one in terms of how fast Biden should lift sanctions. But there is one thing that I agree entirely with the Iranians, despite the fact that much of what I said has been quite antagonistic towards their policy. There's one thing I agree with the Iranians entirely, in that it is absolutely incredulous that they should be asked to take the first step of an Iran deal that they agreed and that they signed and that they were going to respect in order to bring back these negotiations once more, when it's the Americans that essentially withdrew. Because the message you're sending to Iran is this, is that we can do what we like, when we like, at the time of our choosing, and you have no choice but to react and but to adapt to what we decide we want to do. And Iran is essentially saying, look, we need this deal badly, we want this deal, but don't get it twisted. We beat you in Yemen, we beat you in Iraq, we're beating you in Syria, we're doing very well in Lebanon. You also have to talk to us. And that's why I think when we talk about this issue of whether the hardliners will influence the road to negotiations, it's also important to put that question within a framework that appreciates that Iran was not the party that rejected talks or that withdrew from the deal in the first place.
Sami, thank you for that caveat. So we will try to finish at 7:30. So I'm just going to read the two questions in the chat. And then Cinzia and Andreas, I'd like to come to both of you. But Sami, there is one that is specifically directed at you. So before I do that, I'll ask you just in a few short words if you can give a quick answer to this one. It says, given the Israeli provocations to Iran, even before signing the agreement again, will Iran condition its talks on the issue with US on assurance against Israeli provocations? So again, we're going back to the Israel dimension. So Sami, just in one or two lines, if you can quickly give your thoughts on that.
Iran's economy is essentially like near rock bottom. It's struggling badly, especially as a result of COVID-19. Iran is not in a position to make these kind of conditions to the US, and it knows the US will never accept such a condition, and nor will it seek to rein in the Israelis. The Iranians want the deal for one reason only, because they believe that it is a road to lifting sanctions, to economic empowerment, to dealing with the situations that are there domestically while preserving a significant chunk of their foreign policy gains. Iran is very realistic about the deal. It doesn't believe that there will be a complete overhaul, but Iran is looking at it in terms of short-term goals. Lift the sanctions, get my economy better, preserve as much foreign policy gains as I want so that I can resume my expansion later on within a framework, albeit with very different tactics. I don't think for Iran, Israel is a big issue or a big deal at all. Iran knows full well it can't make any conditions on that. It won't secure any conditions on this. It's important to highlight that when we're looking at Iran, and I think it's reflected a lot in what Adnan is saying in terms of the economic situation and the consensus that the JCPOA is a good thing. Iran wants economic relief, and that is its utmost priority when it's pursuing the JCPOA, because it knows that the US and the other parties to the negotiation cannot realistically curb Iran's foreign policy gains. That's safe. It's all about trying to get some domestic relief.
Thank you very much, Sami. So the question that also got put down was, what about Lebanon and Syria? How will the USA's return to the JCPOA affect the crisis in the two countries? Cinzia and Andreas, any thoughts from both of you?
Yes, so I think that I will address this question by combining 2 points made by Andreas and Sami before. So Andreas said something that I think is very important. We should be wary of thinking that both the Europeans and the US will have are thinking about Middle East geopolitics as a strategic priority. And they will not have much bandwidth because everyone is very much concerned with domestic issues, economic malaise, and containing the pandemic, of course. So there will be, I think, some kind of optimization in a way, different players focusing on specific issues, specific crises that are particularly relevant for their own priorities. And at the same time, I mean, what we can hope for and what I've argued in favor in the paper is for a division of labor. And here I come to Sami's point when he says that the EU does not have any geopolitical leverage. It's, of course, it's 100% correct. And that's why I think that when we think of European geopolitics, we have to imagine a flexible engagement of so-called core groups or coalition of the willings between groups of individual European countries, including the United Kingdom, who instead has much presence and deeper leverage in the Gulf, and individual European member states, with under the diplomatic umbrella, if you will, of the EU. And that's, I think, especially relevant in places like Lebanon and Syria, where we could argue that the EU as such, so as a comprehensive interest, there is just one angle that is particularly relevant, which is the humanitarian angle, in particular in Syria. And then if we look at individual players, we see that France, again, Emmanuel Macron has been particularly active on Lebanon, trying to play a more political role. But we haven't seen anybody else within Europe really stepping up to support those plans and those ideas. And I think that, you know, this, unfortunately, this piecemeal approach of really focusing on specific interests and specific initiatives or domains in the different crises, even those like Lebanon and Syria, will continue, because geopolitically, I don't see how, for instance, even the US and their return to the JCPOA could really impact, in particular, Syria, where it's only a matter of how much has Assad won, because the fact that he won, I think, is well understood everywhere, even in Paris, where there is still a very staunch opposition to that. It's still a matter of determining how much did he win. And so I think, we have to be very realistic and look for alternative approaches to have impact by division of labor and combining strengths where possible.
Thank you very much, Cinzia. Andreas, anything you'd like to add?
Okay, great. Yeah, I want to touch upon kind of a kind of summing it up, the last three questions. I agree with everything that was said, obviously, about, you know, the so-called hardliners and where they stand on all of this. Obviously, you know, we need to understand that Iran is really pushed into a corner. I think maximum pressure has alleviated insecurity and inferiority complex within the deep state in Iran, the fear of obviously potential regime toppling, regime insecurity, and in this context, both, you know, the Israeli aspect of it is not something, the Israeli threat or the threat that's posed by Israelis will never be part of. You know, they will never outsource this to the Americans to give them any guarantees that Israel will not provoke. I agree with Adnan on this. You know, the Israelis will continue these operations. They are deadly, they are violent, but they are below the threshold of war. They will continue, and Iran will prepare for, you know, any sort of defensive approach to this. In a broader spectrum, if you look at Syria and Lebanon, I see both of these conflicts as, you know, these were opportunities that presented themselves to Iran, somewhat for ideological reasons, but not only for ideological reasons. I think they're tied into a wider grand strategic defense that Iran is building up in the region, which, you know, is more of a mosaic defense, where you're trying to build networks that can kind of engage your enemies far away from your own borders and your own homeland. You know, following the Iraq-Iran war and, you know, a very, very destructive war on Iranian homeland. You know, this whole surrogate approach that Iran is taking in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, is one that is a defensive one, not an offensive one, despite the fact that it's always been perceived by the other side as being highly offensive. But it comes out of a weakness and an insecurity. That weakness and insecurity is exacerbated by the sanctions regime. It's exacerbated by maximum pressure, and obviously will lead the Iranians to be even less willing to surrender anything that they might have been able to surrender or willing to surrender during the last JCPOA talks, just because they know there is no one they can trust. There's no one they can trust in Europe. There's definitely no one they can trust in Washington. And obviously, as governments change in the West, with it, policy changes. And obviously, America is a great example of this. So in this context, the Lebanon and Syria engagement of Iran will continue. It will continue regardless of where the JCPOA 2.0 or plus, whatever you want to call it, is going, because is no context in which Iran will surrender that leverage that they have, in the same way that Iran will not give up and surrender any of its ballistic missile capability, because it's an insurance policy. And the engagement in Syria is an insurance policy in the same way the engagement in Lebanon is some sort of insurance policy vis-a-vis Israel. Obviously, these operations will continue. And I think a lot more pressure and threat to these operations in Syria and Lebanon, particularly in Syria, is actually not coming from the West. It's not coming from the United States. It's coming from Turkey at the moment. It's coming from Russia at the moment. The engagement of the PKK, I think we might see another escalation in northern Iraq, with Turkey planning a much wider military operation against the PKK, not just against the PKK, but the PKK engaging with Iranian-backed Hashd al-Shaabi. I mean, these are all interesting developments. Then over Azerbaijan and about the Karabakh region, we also saw Turkey and Iran being on opposite sides here. We saw in Syria as well, Iran and Turkey being on opposite sides and continuously being on opposite sides. So there is some tension developing there. There's tension between the Russian proxies and Iranian proxies within Syria developing as well. So there are a lot of points of friction here where the Americans have they're not even sitting at the table. They're not a party to the conflict. Nobody will consult them on this. And the same is true for Europe. Obviously, Europe is even further removed from all this. So we shouldn't kid ourselves in terms of the leverage that America or Europe can bring to the table this time around. It's highly limited in comparison to the first time when Obama reached out, just because a lot of trust has been actually spoiled.
Andreas, thank you very much for that kind of comprehensive wrap up. So a huge thank you to all our speakers today for their fantastic and insightful speeches, the discussion, the conversation. I, for one, really enjoyed it, and I hope everyone who's participated today enjoyed it just as much as I did, if not more. So thank you so much to the Middle East Dialogue Centre for making conversations like today possible. I think it's very important that we do have dialogue on these important issues. And we heard a lot today, not only about how the Iran nuclear talks are multifaceted, they are complicated, but actually there is light at the end of the tunnel, even if it is a tightrope that is going to be walked along the way, and that different actors, including Qatar, do have a role to play within that. So I hope that's a conclusion everyone feels represents the conversation of today. But you know what? Keep the conversation going on Twitter. So please, please, please don't forget to keep tweeting about the event, posting about it, whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, different platforms. A huge thank you to everyone. And Adnan, I will definitely be connecting with you so that I can practice your surname. So that is on my New Year's resolution list. Thank you very much, everyone.